What does the future hold? A leaked document showing how and why governments are behaving the way they are is now available. Hello everyone, I am Chris Martinson. I'm here with your SARS-CoV-2, aka the honey badger virus update for March 17th, 2020. Why do we call it the honey badger virus? Because this thing is tough and you just can't even give it a moment's inattention because it will come roaring out, escape whatever containment you've got it in, and do a lot of damage. So, where are we today? Let's look at the numbers real quickly here. Again, China's just apparently doesn't have any more cases. That's the end of that. And I mentioned yesterday that I was going to show you some anecdotal evidence that was off. I left that out, so I'm going to include that in today. Don't have Italy's numbers updating on this one yet, but this is from yesterday. Look at them, very rapidly catching up to a nation of 1.3 million people where this thing first broke out, and Italy is catching up very, very quickly. Pretty terrifying ratio here between total recovered and total deaths. Those are the outcomes that have resolved. So far, 23,000 active cases that haven't resolved, and many of those in serious or critical condition. So at any rate, let's hope that these numbers improve, but they're bad as they stand. Iran, Spain coming up really fast here, really having a lot of difficulty, got very slow off the gate, and also had a cultural issue that was, very difficult for them to contain at the outset, because unless your government takes this very seriously at the front end and gives you the right information and really explains what and why you need to, what your role is and why you need to do things like social isolation, distancing, not kissing each other on the cheek, not greeting in the normal ways, all those things. Unless they do that, you're going to have a big problem on your hands. And of course, Germany moving up very rapidly here as well. And but South Korea, look at this. They have really broken the back on this thing. And so they are just poster nation here for the correct way to run something like this. So they did not botch steps 1 through 3. Many governments did. I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but they went through, in particular, the aggressive testing and the rigorous contact tracing, steps 2 and 3, and as well as the subsequent things that are necessary. South Korea showing that if you really put your mind to it, this is the sort of outcome that you can achieve, but it takes a lot of work, and that's pretty expensive. The United States creeping up here because testing is finally starting to come online, but look at the ratio here. No way is that correct. I'm going to bet that the United States is about as far along as many of these other countries. So let's double, triple, quadruple, multiply by 8, 10, whatever you feel is right. But the United States has many, many more cases than they've officially admitted to through their testing program at this point. Switzerland coming up fast on the curve here, and the UK as well. And I want to talk about the response that's coming out of the UK because I think it's driving the response of a variety of countries, and that would include many of these as well. So what else can I tell you? Let's just look here, though, at China's cases. Let's pretend that these numbers are right for a second. They had 3,226 total deaths. This is how many total recovered. So if we took those two against each other, 3,226, you add that to this one down here, divide them, and you come up with 4.5% as the case fatality rate that China is saying is theirs. And that's the case fatality rate as it stands. Of course, they still have 3,226 critical. Some of them are going to die. Some of them are going to recover. But even if we said 100% of these serious critical people recovered, that would still, that's what happens here. So now we're just going to divide 3,226 by total cases. That would give us a case fatality rate of around 3.9%. I'm going to bet that Italy comes in a little bit hotter than that on that final statistic as well, based on the numbers as they're presented. And of course, these numbers are all botched because there are a lot of people who get the disease who are asymptomatic the entire time, and we never knew they had it. So that's an interesting piece of information which is going to drag the apparent numbers down, but we don't have good data around that yet, although we have one piece of data around that I'm going to share with you in just a second. So yes, as of March 16th, as expected and predicted, bumped right over the 100,000 mark at 101,592. That put 15 days between one full 10-fold increase from 10,000 cases outside of China to 100,000. Which means that if we call that about 2 weeks, we should be hitting 1 million cases in a couple more weeks. So that would be right around the beginning of April. and then 1 million 2 weeks after, 10 to 10 million 2 weeks after that. Does heat and humidity stop? This is honey badger 19. Well, no, maybe. We thought so for a long time, but very concerningly, looking at the Philippines here with 140 cases really starting to come on strong there. And as well, Thailand is starting to note an uptick in cases, at least reported cases. India's had a fairly stable, this is a fairly flat line here for a while, a fairly flat static number, but Indonesia also now coming up, as well as Vietnam. So both of those in green here. So we're starting to see, you see the shape of this here. I think we all understand what we're looking at here. And a lot of these countries are still not testing very much or at all. So probably this is a lot steeper than that. All right. This really caught my attention, comes out in La Repubblica, came out, I think, just yesterday. So this was really interesting because they did something that was, I think, really essential and needed to be done. And so in anticipation of a strong increase of cases in the region on the basis of the study of inhabitants in Guaguaño, I don't know how to pronounce that, where 3,000 inhabitants of the country were given the swab. And so they tested a lot of people, even though they had no idea. This was done just on a general sampling of the population randomly. It wasn't a test to say, we know that you've been exposed or possibly exposed, let's test you. So this, what did they find when they randomly tested people? They found out that the vast majority of people infected with COVID-19, between 50 and 75%, are completely asymptomatic, but represent a formidable source of contagion. This good news and bad news mixed in here. The good news is if we can get that many people who are completely asymptomatic, we can get to herd immunity faster. The bad news is good luck trying to contain this thing with any sort of defensive or protective measures, right? So this is really a best case, worst case scenario for this particular or any particular viral pathogen. And the worst case about this is how do you have to lock everybody away. It's kind of like everybody's got to wear a face mask or it doesn't really help at all for this exact reason, right? So they continue on here. The percentage of infected people, even if asymptomatic in the population, is very high and represents the majority of cases above all. But not only that, among young people, and the isolation of asymptomatics is essential to be able to control the spread of the virus and the severity of the disease. So this is going to be really complicating, especially for households with teenagers in there, and the teenagers are, immortal and they can't be suppressed and they deserve to live their lives and they're going to want to go out, but they may very well be these asymptomatic carriers and running around and, of course, infecting more vulnerable parts of the population. So it's really tricky to figure out how to manage this. And while we're on the subject of young people, we might as well note that more and more data is coming in. This comes from an emergency physician out of Belgium. He says, we see COVID-19 patients in their 30s with no medical history. Lung images are terrifying. Here's a healthy lung here. Here's one with a little bit of stuff going on, and here's one with really just a lot of exudate in the lung tissue there, and not looking good at all. Younger, healthy people can also be hard hit by the new coronavirus. Emergency doctor Ignacy de Meyer of the OLV hospital in Aalst, Belgium, warns about this. The lung scans of patients entering his shift are downright terrifying, he said. He continues on here. He says, we see people with a blank medical history who are very ill. So blank meaning they don't have comorbidities. It is also not just about older generations. We have had very few older people inside so far. I don't know what he means by that. That's terrifying to me if that's true. We now have people between the ages of 30 and 50 coming in. They all have the same complaints. They've been sick for a week, stayed home with the flu. The flu attack is over, they think. They feel fine for 2 days. And then they report with complaints of a dry cough and shortness of breath. When we then have their oxygen saturation, we see that they have very low oxygen saturation for their age. All right, so this reinforces the idea that we've talked about before, that there's sort of a biphasic attack of this particular virus if you're going to go down the bad path. So a lot of people have that first attack, they recover, everything's fine. But if you're not going to be fine, maybe 8 days or so after the first onset of symptoms, maybe even after they appear to be resolving, then all of a sudden it hits you harder and again, and that's where it's attacking in your lungs. And so that's what I mean by biphasic. You have that first phase, the second phase. And it's in that second phase where that dry cough comes up and that shortness of breath. So if you're having that symptom, the dry cough and shortness of breath, then it's probably time to get down to the hospital for sure. All right. The rallying cry, of course, has to be flatten the curve. And had a number of people say that this expression they found a little offensive. And I'm just, listen, we're just going to all have to be tougher here. If words like that are going to throw you off and prevent you from being able to absorb this information, good luck with the rest of everything that's coming. That's all I'm going to say. So sometimes I do use language like that because it sometimes gets the point across in a way that is necessary, I think. All right. The study that rattled the U.S. is the same study that's probably rattled the U.K. And if you remember, we had this guy, Neil, we didn't have him on, but we played a clip of him a long time ago, probably within the first week of reporting, where he was thinking that China actually had 50,000 cases when they were reporting a few thousand cases, and 50,000 cases per day. So this is coming out of a Center for Global Infectious Disease Analysis. They're modeling something here. And so here they modeled the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions to reduce COVID-19 mortality and healthcare demand. So Neil Ferguson, again, is the person who was in charge of this. And I want to go through this study with you because I think it tells us a lot about where we're going in the future and why governments are behaving the way they are. Okay. So first, an important distinction here, distinguishing between suppression and mitigation. Suppression, what's that? Here, the aim is to reduce the reproduction number, the average number of secondary cases each case generates, that's the R, to below 1, and hence to reduce case numbers to low levels, or, as for SARS and Ebola, eliminate human-to-human transmission. So that's suppression. We're going to get the R naught below 1, and we're going to eliminate human-to-human transmission if we're good at it. The main challenge of this approach is that NPIs, and drugs if available, need to be maintained, at least intermittently, for as long as the virus is circulating in the human population or until a vaccine becomes available. That's the main challenge right there. In the case of COVID-19, it'll be at least 12 to 18 months before a vaccine is available, and furthermore, there is no guarantee that initial vaccines will have high efficacy. All right, so that's suppression. What about mitigation? What's that? Well, here, the aim is to use the NPIs and vaccines or drugs if available, not to interrupt transmission completely, but to reduce the health impact of an epidemic, akin to the strategy adopted by some U.S. cities in 1918 and by the world more generally in the 1957, 68, and 2009 influenza pandemics. In the 2009 pandemic, for instance, early supplies of vaccine were targeted at individuals with pre-existing medical conditions which put them at risk of a more severe disease. In this scenario, population immunity builds up through the epidemic, leading to an eventual rapid decline in case numbers and transmission dropping to low levels. And really, I think what's left, which is sort of coyly hinted at here, the main challenge of this approach, it needs to be maintained. That's code speak for, hey, this is really going to be economically damaging if we do this. So the question here is, if you do mitigation, what variables do you play with to try and set the burn rate of this thing at a level that allows it to sweep through your population, but not so fast that it totally overwhelms your healthcare system? All right. So if mitigation is your strategy, here's some outcome assumptions they had. So they grouped it by age years, and then they said, what % of symptomatic cases would require hospitalization? Here's some numbers that they ran with, just so you know what their variables were set at. What % of hospitalized cases would require critical care? So it's if you're hospitalized, 5%, 5. But then it starts doubling here between the ages of 40 and 80. So it goes to 6 to 12 to 27 to 43 to 70, roughly doubling. And so that's pretty close to the numbers that I have in my mind for what I've seen out there as well. And then the infection fatality ratio, clocking in overall at about, whatever that average would be across the population. So I actually think these are probably a little bit low based on what I'm seeing coming out of Italy right now and based on what China has reported, knowing that those are wrong. All right, so this is why I think this is the study that actually rattled the U.S. and has probably rattled the U.K. leadership as well, is because if you don't run any interventions, Great Britain's going to have a total of 510,000 deaths, and the U.S. would have a total of 2.2 million deaths. And the curves here are modeling out deaths per day per 100,000 of population. So if this is 17 and you were in a city with 1 million people in it, you'd have 170 deaths per day while the infection was burning at its peak. And it eventually burns itself out because you end up with herd immunity. So this is probably not an acceptable way to go. So what could you do? Well, there's a variety of interventions you can run. And the first thing they run, and these can be run in combination. It's not this or that or that. It could be a Chinese menu of those, and you'd select this, that, or that. Oh, awkward phrasing there. All right. So what are this summary of these NPIs or non-pharmaceutical interventions? A little double speak there. All right. First is CI, case isolation in the home. Symptomatic cases stay home for 7 days, reducing non-household contacts by 75%. That's good. You're not out getting people sick all over this place. That's wonderful. Household contacts remain unchanged. Assume 70% of households comply with the policy. So see, they're not assuming everybody's down with the program. So they assume some leakage in this, which is probably very reasonable. Home quarantine, voluntary home quarantine following identification of a symptomatic case in the household. All members remain at home for 14 days. All members. Household contact rates double during this quarantine period. Contacts in the community reduced by 70%. Assume half the households comply with the policy. All right, how about social distancing for those over 70 years of age? Because those are the ones who are really hit the hardest here. So what if we just did that? This reduced contacts by 50% in workplaces, increased household contacts by 25%, and reduces other contacts by 75%. And let's assume we can get higher compliance with this policy. Probably the case because people care about keeping themselves alive in that age bracket, I bet. So makes sense. Social distancing of entire population. All households reduce outside contact, school or workplace by 75%. So that would be a 1 in 4. Remember we had those little bouncing balls yesterday? So that's the 1 in 4 balls is actually moving around, and 3 out of the 4 balls is stationary. School contact rates unchanged. Workplace contact rates reduced by 25%. That makes sense there. Household contact rates also assumed to increase by 25% because people are in their home, bumping into each other there and spreading things at home. All right, and how about PC, which is the closure of schools and universities? Closure of all schools, 25% of universities remain open. Household contact rates for student families increased by 50% during closure. Contacts in the community increased by 25% during closure. So those are the interventions. Those are things that can be done. So we've already seen some of these, the social distancing of entire population, handed down in the United States with the closure of bars, restaurants, gathering places, things like that. So carrying on. So if we're just aiming towards, mitigation, the aim of mitigation is to reduce the impact of an epidemic by flattening the curve, reducing peak incidence and overall deaths. We'll get to figure 2 next. It's coming up. Since the aim of mitigation is to minimize mortality, the interventions need to remain in place for as much of the epidemic period as possible. Introducing such interventions too early risks allowing transmission to return once they are lifted, if insufficient herd immunity is developed. Let's take that one more time because this is an important sentence here. Introducing such interventions too early risks allowing transmission to return once they are lifted, meaning these things are hard to maintain. So if you put everybody under quarantine, but you do it too early, what happens is people, need to eat. They need to get back to work. They get tired of the whole thing. Anyway, you can't keep people under quarantine forever. It's just a known thing. So this is saying you have to have the interventions come at a later and a right time. I think that explains why some governments have seemingly been very slow slow moving on all of this. Is perhaps they're trying to time this with some level of precision. It is therefore necessary to balance the timing of introduction with the scale of disruption imposed and the likely period over which the interventions can be maintained. In this scenario, interventions can limit transmission to the extent that little herd immunity is acquired. Oh, see, there's a balance here, leading to the possibility that a second wave of infection is seen once interventions are lifted. So they're really talking here, what's the right throttling amount to allow you let your foot off the brake a little bit, and you just have to let this burn through. So I think that we've already seen what they're talking about here. China had very, very aggressive lockdowns and things like that. So in 2 cities in Hubei province, they were locked down again after opening for only 1 day. Again, I can't totally confirm this, but it does look like the police have pulled up. And so this would be something we would expect to happen. You put everybody in lockdown, everything's good. You let people out of lockdown, and it rages through again, because if China's numbers are to be believed and they only had 80,000 cases, that's a fraction of a percent of their entire population. So they have no herd immunity. You let people out. As long as this virus is still circulating, guess what? You're going to have an outbreak happen again. All right. So this, I think, defines then what our future together is going to look like. So here, this is the final model they came out with in this particular study we're talking about now. And this red line is surge critical care bed capacity. So that's all you can possibly withstand. Here they're modeling out this disease. I believe this is for the UK, these models, this particular set of curves. And it's showing black is, well, we do nothing. And it just burns through, and you get all these excess deaths resulting from that. But what if you just close schools and universities? What if you did that? Well, you kind of you bump the curve down, you do flatten it, and you shift it a little bit to the right. Both good things. What if we do case isolation? Well, then you get this result. What if we do case isolation and household quarantine? Well, now we're getting to here. What if we do case isolation, home quarantine, and social distancing over 70s? And now we got our best outcome here, but notice it's still not where we want to be. So this model is a little bit dire in the sense of saying that there's not really any particular easy option. There's only hard options left, and we can't even get ourselves all the way to where we want to be. But this, inarguably, is better than that. No question about it. So how do we explain this? I see things like this all the time. So this is somebody sharing the testimony at the request of an A&E doctor in the north of England who writes, "It's absolute carnage in A&E, utter chaos. We don't have any proper PPE. We're being given crappy paper masks, not FFP3 masks that we need. I'm in shock. I feel like we're being thrown to the wolves. Some of us are going to die. We know some will die. And the government just clearly doesn't give a shit about us, do they? I mean, we've known since January this was coming. We all knew it. But the herd immunity plan was always going to end up with thousands of sick, infectious people swamping the hospitals." Did no one actually think about the doctors and nurses who are going to die because of this plan? Did no one think to start stockpiling PPE in January? Well, the answer is no. Nobody did think about that. And once they were caught flat-footed, they didn't come out and say, "We're so sorry. We really forgot. We forgot even the most minimal basic planning, which would include stockpiling PPE," which was just a dunce move, right? That they didn't do that. But I think what's being experienced here out in the hospitals is that somebody's already starting to run a plan at the higher government levels. They've already figured out sort of how they want to get to herd immunity as quickly as possible, because the conclusion of this study, and I think the response to why does my country seem to be doing nothing, is that when they ran these models out and said, well, there's that first initial blast, you either have this giant you have this giant horrible period here, but then you've got herd immunity then. But what if you went through really draconian things and you managed to suppress it here through all this stuff, and maybe you even trash your economy? What if it's just going to come back anyway later on, right? And so that was the model they were running. And so I think that people in government are saying, well, if it was going to happen one way or the other, let's just get it over with. I think that's possibly how they're thinking about this. If so, I think that needs to be clearly communicated to people, so that that lying, the whole thing of them lying about face masks and saying that, they don't help, that they are actually more harmful for how average people to use, was all junk, all complete junk, hogwash. And that lying really harmed trust. And when we're finding out about, that there are larger plans to sort of let it burn rather than be as humane as we possibly can be about this, compounded by the absolute failure to plan. This is, I think, what's driving some decisions out there. And of course, your government is more likely to be running that sort of a scenario of letting it burn if they have already past tense botched steps 1 through 3, which would be stopping the inbound infections, having an aggressive testing program in place, and then doing all your rigorous contact tracing and all that goes with it. Number 4 belongs to the medical system. All right, with that, I'm going to switch now, big switch, of course, to the economy. I think this is, if you don't understand what's happening in the economy, you can't understand why governments are doing what they're doing in terms of their approach to wanting to get through the herd immunity as quickly as possible. Because for an exponential economy like ours that's predicated on a constant flow of materials and goods and has a huge amount of debt baked into it, it turns out that the sort of social isolation pieces that we have going on right now to try and get to the healthcare aspects and the human aspects of this disease, very bad for banking, finance systems, things like that. So, Richard Wolff wrote here today, coronavirus as an excuse. Mutating viruses have always been with us. A rational economic system would have learned to plan and manage them. Capitalism failed to learn because profit was its number one priority. Capitalism caused today's disaster, not the latest virus. I'm going to give that a sorta. And the reason for that is that you have to understand that we haven't had capitalism for a long time, actually. We've had something quite different from this, a hybrid system. And it's really been, to be blunt, it's been about privatizing profits and socializing losses. Our central banks, including the Federal Reserve, have really been cheerleaders of a form of capitalism that really hasn't been this sort of, laissez-faire, bare-knuckle, winner, may the best company survive kind of a moment. We don't have that. That went away a number of years ago. And I'm going to illustrate that by saying here's a headline that just came out yesterday. Coronavirus could bankrupt most airlines by end of May. Okay. So, that doesn't sound good. So guess what's going to happen here? This just came out today. The Trump administration proposed $850 billion stimulus package, and a part of that is going to be $50 billion. It's going to be earmarked for the airline industry, citing 2 unnamed Trump administration officials. Well, if the airline industry needs bailing out, Chris, don't we need airplanes and things? Yeah, I'm kind of with you. I understand that, but first, let's get some essential context on this. Let's understand that airlines spent 96% of their free cash flow on stock buybacks, right? 96% of their, look at this, not just recently, but over the last decade, 96% of free cash flow last decade on buying back their own shares, okay? And what was that all about? Well, this was a way for the executives in these airline companies to reward themselves. So they have stock options. They're being rewarded through stock options. How do you make your stock price go up? Well, you make the company go out and buy those shares, and guess what? The share price goes up, and because the share price went up, it triggered your bonus, and your shares that you were awarded went up in price and all of that. So at any rate, it was kind of a scam, and it was really rooted very simply on a very simple idea, which is you have your earnings, and you have your price down here. Excuse me. And this is so we're basically getting towards an earnings per share, right? Earnings per share. All right. Well, how do you make earnings per share go up? You reduce the number of shares. That's what you do. So you buy back your own shares, and look, my earnings per share went up, even though nothing actually, good went up for the company. So it was a financial gimmick, and I'm not just going to pick on the airline companies here because a lot of companies did this all across the entire industry. But this is what the Federal Reserve fostered and really enabled and encouraged and did all kinds of things. So I was talking about this, and a lot of people were for a long time saying this was going to be a problem someday. So here it is. So now it's a problem, right? Look at this. American Airlines Group, one company, purchased more than $12.5 billion of its shares, just one. So if we need $50 billion in bailing out for these companies right now, well, look how what was that? A fourth of that total number right there was just by one airline company, right? But it was very broad. Like I said, the S&P index as a whole allocated about 50% of its total free cash flows for buying back stocks, which is, it goosed the prices of shares, but it left the company's balance sheets heavily exposed to any sort of a downturn. So what I wrote about this is, I said, I would actively support an airline bailout. We at Peak Prosperity would actually do that under one condition, that the boards of directors and the C-suite executives of these airlines suffer a 5-year clawback on all compensation for having run a ruinous stock buyback scheme to enrich them. Dumbassery should not be rewarded. So this whole thing, again, we're seeing, oh no, it's a crisis. And guess what happens in a crisis? Big companies and the very wealthy and the big banks, they all get bailed out. And this is a bailout. Make no mistake. They're going to call it various things like, loans and, lines of credit and all that other stuff, making it sound like they're just extending a helping hand. But in truth, this is a bailout. And so we don't see the similar sorts of bailouts being given to people, not to the so-called little people, right? So, check this out. So I think that this virus is going to expose our actual values as a nation. So look at this, came out today. Joint statement by conservatives Stephen Moore, Art Laffer, and Steve Forbes. Don't expand welfare and other income redistribution benefits like paid leave and unemployment benefits that will inhibit growth and discourage work. Why aren't they saying that about this? Let's not give handouts to the airline industry, because that might inhibit growth and encourage them to behave badly. All right. So I don't agree with this. A lot of people are turning out not to agree with this. Darius Dale at Hedgeye here said, I say we grant the airline industry this request minus the sum of their stock buybacks. Matter of fact, the U.S. government should honor the bailout requests of every industry under this strict standard, privatize gains but socialize losses. So yeah, if any industry needs a bailout, whatever you did in stock buybacks, you don't get that. That gets reduced, taken out of this. So that's even more than a clawback of just the executive compensation and the board compensation. As well, it goes further than that. What very few realize is that the Fed's actions over the past 48 hours are primarily intended to prevent a few massive hedge funds from completely immobilizing markets as they de-risk leveraged trades. It's not about the little guy or the corner business. The Federal Reserve is really there of, by, and for the banks and for the financial system. There are these massive hedge funds that do nothing. They produce nothing for society. Zero. They do nothing. They skim. They make money by using money. They had these massive leverage trades. All of those are blowing up right now, and the Federal Reserve is riding to their rescue rather than having worked over the past 10 years to not allow them to become the big, giant systemic risks that they actually currently are. The Fed and the Treasury, Dave Collum up here writes, are considering a commercial paper bailout facility, even for the ones who use debt to buy back shares so that execs can cash in their options? I dare you. I'm going long pitchforks if you do this and keeping one for myself. And I'm right there with you. This is fourth turning kind of stuff. This is, it's really annoying and angering that these large companies made really stupid decisions and then all of a sudden they need a bailout. And you know where that bailout comes from? It comes from the little people, right? And we're going to pay for it with inflation. We're going to pay for it with reduced purchasing power of our dollars. We're going to pay for it with lost jobs. There's all kinds of things that are going to happen as a consequence of that. And by the way, this was all completely foreseeable. I'm not just suddenly going, oh, I noticed this, let me point it out. I've been writing about this for many, many years, as have a lot of other people. All right, I tweeted this yesterday, and I said I would explain it. Here's the Federal Reserve saying, we had to act to save the system, and whatever that system is. Well, for whatever reason, the system decided that the spreads, this is called investment grade spreads. So what we're looking at here is a gap between how much yield you would get for a U.S. Treasury bond, which is a very safe bond, considered as safe as they come. So it is almost considered risk-free. So the U.S. Treasury bond and a corporate bond. And so that's measured in these things called basis points. 100 basis points is 1%. And so if you might say, well, I'll lend, the U.S. government money at 2% for 10 years, but that would mean with a 100 basis point spread, well, I would want 3% out of a company, right? And so when you get down here, this is very, very low amounts of additional risk that you're being compensated for. When you're down here, look at this 80 basis points. That's it. Just tiny, like less, a fraction of a percent. That's all we're going to get in the spread. But things tend to get crazy and the spreads blow out during times of crisis. So 2006 was an obvious moment of crisis. Things started to blow out. The Fed stepped in and printed money like crazy to drive all this down. And they had to do it to save the system. But nobody's asking why even this level was 2%. Like crazy, too high, but the Fed felt they had to rescue that. Well, right now what we're seeing is this absolute, I've never seen anything like this, absolute stunning blowout in these spreads, and this is now above the 2016 crisis. And so what we're looking at here is this says there's something deeply wrong in the plumbing of the system, but this is in the financial system. This is deep down there in the darkness of it. This isn't the stock market. This isn't, has nothing to do with what's going on with the liquidity at your local bank or anything like that. This is just what happens when speculators make colossally wrong bets that are all on the wrong side of the boat. They don't have nearly enough compensation for risk, and all of a sudden they get a new sense of risk, and these spreads blow out. So this is one of the things I look at when I'm trying to find out how close to trouble, real trouble, are we. Here's another example of failed capitalism. Boeing Company has asked White House and congressional officials for short-term aid for itself, suppliers, and airlines as the outlook for the travel industry worsens by the day. People familiar with the matter said, I didn't put the link. This comes from a Zero Hedge article. The U.S. plane maker seeking to avoid layoffs and damage to hundreds of smaller companies that make parts and systems for its aircraft. Well, yeah, that's terrible. Yeah, let's avoid that. Let's avoid that. So nobody in their right minds should give Boeing even 1 penny in short-term aid, they're writing here. Instead, management and the board should be ordered to sell as much stock as they need. The opposite of buying it back, to maintain the business, even if that means sending the stock price crashing far lower. So that nails it on the head. What Boeing is trying to do by asking for a bailout is, so they drove up their stock price by buying their shares back. Here's their stock buybacks. This is 5 billion, 10, 20, 25. I think if I'm reading those numbers right, that seems to say 30, 25, 20. Okay, 15, 10, 5. Got it. So look at this. If that's 10. So 10, 15, $20 billion of stock buybacks, just quarter after quarter after quarter. It's all they did because this drove up the share price, and this made their executives get very well compensated. But now those same executives are saying, oh, please, can we have a handout? Instead of saying, well, I guess, if we need to raise money, we can always just sell these shares that we bought back into the market. Of course, that would send the stock price lower, and they hate that. So they want to bail out instead. Because it's called capitalism, because there's no reason why taxpayers should foot the bill for a company, which instead of saving cash when times were good, was handing it out to shareholders and a handful of executives, and which should now, for some insane reason, be eligible for a bailout when times suddenly go bad. So in your household, if you did something dumb, like you went out and just spent all your money on something that you then lost all that money and then you got in trouble, that you just get in trouble. That's how that works. There's a thing called bankruptcy and all of that. So there's a set of rules that are being exposed here. Again, this COVID-19 is exposing our nation's actual values. This is a company that instead of saying, how do we get out of the problem we created for ourselves? This is self-inflicted wound right here. This is leveraging their own balance sheet. This is them swapping their own company's debt for internal for equity. So they reduce their equity, increase their debt. That's an internal leverage buyout. That's what they did. So, and that's very risky because when times go bad, that bites you in the butt. And so I like the conclusion here. No, let's force Boeing and others like it that spent billions repurchasing its stock while incurring massive amounts of debt to just sell stock. After all, that's what a public company's stock is. It's a currency. And just as Boeing could repurchase it when it had cash and lifted its stock price to all-time highs, it should now have to sell its stock and use the proceeds to fund itself, like any other corporation does when it needs funding, or any other household in this example. As well, I want to get one more piece on the nation's actual values. So Elon Musk has really been downplaying and poo-pooing CV19 or HB19. Fear is the mind killer. He's just been trying to convince people that we're just afraid of this thing in an irrational way. And so somehow Elon got Alameda County, which is under a full, essential business only quarantine out there in California, one of those 6 San Francisco area counties. Alameda County has declared Tesla an essential business. Really? Making cars is an essential business? And Elon wants you to come into work unless you're already sick. But this disease spreads from asymptomatic carriers in a crowd, like a factory shift. Sociopath. So this is, this is really exposing the values that we've got going on here. And it's as grubby as it looks. It really is. This whole idea that it's only welfare that gets screamed about when it applies to people, but not to corporations, and that somehow making electric cars that are bought by wealthy people is an essential business is another one of those strange decisions that exposes the actual values that are in play here. All right. Remember, this thing is not the flu. It's not SARS. I think everything on here has been pretty well confirmed at this point. Maybe the 5 to 3 I'm starting to think is that's a little bit too high, so it might be 4 to 3 or something like that. But it still looks like it hits men a little bit more than women in the other data that we're seeing right now. The conclusions for today: there are lots and lots of asymptomatic carriers out there. So if you have 10 cases that are known about where you live, multiply that by some whole number. There might be 10,000 actual circulating cases. We don't know. But that Italian data said lots and lots of asymptomatic carriers, there. Each of us has a vital role in flattening the curve. Of course we do. That's up to you to figure out where and how you want to protect yourself and you and yours, because I think we know what the governments are going to be running. I think we have a sense of their strategy now. So that means that your outcome is up to you, whether you want to be sort of part of and tossed in with one of these big crushes of people who end up in the hospital or not. So you get to decide how you're going to play that. The Federal Reserve is right now, it's just busy bailing out Wall Street, leveraged speculators. This is after they created the conditions that allowed these leveraged speculators to flourish in the first place. And it's horribly unfair. Billions and billions, however many billions they need, 100 billion, 700 billion, a trillion, whatever Wall Street and the leveraged speculators need. And again, these people do nothing for society. They skim. They don't create anything. They don't actually add any value. They're not actually capital distributors, which is an important thing. Most of them just make money with money. Like a lot of these leveraged speculators that are blowing up right now, most of them are out there running high-frequency trading algorithms that skim pennies off of trades, which adds nothing to the whole system. All right. And there are no good choices left. Governments will choose an acceptable level of deaths. I think that's what they're left with right now, because they botched the early testing, detection, and isolation efforts. Okay, so again, Singapore has this all pretty well, tightly under control. No problem. Taiwan, same story. South Korea, getting there, got it under control now. But they had very aggressive early testing, detection, and isolation efforts, and I don't see any of those being available currently in the UK, a lot of Europe, the US. And so those governments, when having to choose between an acceptable level of deaths or figuring out how to do the hard work of ramping up testing, detection, and isolation efforts, I think they're going to default to this. And that feels kind of like how this is going right now, which means you're on your own. We're all on our own. Actually, our communities are on our own. You are not fully isolated on your own. But I do believe that we have to think for ourselves. We have to assemble this data for ourselves. We have to understand what the different players, what their motivations are, understand that our interests may not be aligned with theirs. That's all. And it didn't have to be this way. It really didn't. We could have done this so much more differently. And the time for that is pretty much in the rearview mirror. So now we have to manage this as best we can. The only thing that really determines the fate of our future at this point is what's the shape? What sort of curves are we actually going to be facing here? What do they actually look like? And know that getting to herd immunity is something that we need to get to at some point, because I think we'll probably get to that before we get to a vaccine. But who knows? Maybe that new RNA vaccine will be the bomb and it'll actually work and it'll be cheap and easily ramped up and put out. We don't know. But for now, I think you have to plan on being on your own for a while, and it's going to be a good long chunk of time. And I think we all need to understand that we have a role in how this turns out, a very vital role. All right. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.
Hi folks, Adam Taggart here. Chris Martenson and I are the co-founders of Peak Prosperity. If you want to get alerted whenever we release a new video from Chris, just click the red subscribe button right beneath the YouTube video player. Once you've done that, a little bell icon will appear right next to it. Click on that bell. It looks like this. And that's it. The next time we publish a video from Chris, you'll immediately receive a notification from YouTube. Thanks for watching our videos.